Let's begin with narratives or stories as the first genre we can talk about. It's definitely a prominent part of the Bible, right? Depending on how you count the different pages of the Bible and what's on it. Narratives is something like 40% or something of the Bible. Like in the New Testament, you have the Gospels and Acts that are a lot of stories. Of course, sometimes it's parables, sometimes it's speeches from Jesus. Should you categorize that as a speech or sermon, or should you categorize this as a story, since it's part of a story, And the Old Testament prophets are sometimes stories, sometimes sermons, sometimes parables. Again, so hard to classify, but there's no doubt that stories is a big part of the scriptures. So we're learning what God is doing, what God's people are doing, and other people not following God. And it's all a lot of good and bad human actions. The Bible clearly doesn't portray its God's followers only in a perfect light, not in the sense of perfect saints. But how do we get lessons out of stories? Oh, that's an interesting one. But let's begin talking about how to analyze stories, the important story elements you should look for. And before I say this, I should probably preface this with we're saying that for some of you, this comes very intuitively. You read a story and you just immediately grasp how it works and how to preach on it and how to get a lesson out of it. So if you and stories click, if stories is a genre you like and you kind of get it, then what I'm going to say now is probably not crucial. And in a sense, it's a little bit like complicating what is natural to you. So, just to compare it with if somebody is going to teach me how to drive a car right now, driving a car is something I do automatically. I just get in the car and my hands and feet and so on, eyes, and yes, everything, I'm kind of doing things routinely. But if someone is going to teach me how to use a manual stick shift, you press the clutch in, with your hand you put the stick into first gear, then you with the right foot push the accelerator a little bit in, with that's the right foot, and then with the left foot you take the clutch out to kind of in the middle somewhere. When it starts to grab, the engine starts to connect with the wheels, you leave it there for a second lingering, then you take it all the way out while you with the right foot push the accelerator a bit more. That's just one detail of car driving, right? Changing gear on the manual stick shift. And if you've been driving for a while, it kind of almost makes no sense to describe it in such detail, because you just get it, you just do it. And for some of you, stories are like that. You naturally grasp it. But for those of you who find stories more perplexing to preach on, here is something I suggest you pay attention to when you read stories. First of all, we have the background, the location. If you're thinking about the story in the Bible like a play in a theater, this element is like the scene, what's happening up on the platform where the actors are. So you might be some background images, and might be some furniture there, might be this and that. So whatever is kind of the background in the story in the Bible, that's one element to look for. And then we have the characters and the description of the characters. Are they good? Are they bad? In what ways are they good or bad? What are the how are they characterized? And what's the function of this character in the plot? I mean, is this the protagonist, the hero? Is this the an antagonist, enemy of the hero, or is it more a supportive role? We have a lot of characters, people appearing in the stories in the Bible, and not all of them are in the center. Not all of them are protagonists. Some have more minor functions for the plot. And that leads us to the third element, the plot, the action and the dialogues, what's happening. Again, if it helps you, if these terms are new to you, if you think of it as a theater play, then the first one is the scene up on the stage, the stage, and how that is, how that looks. Then we have the characters are the people, the actors up on the stage, and then the plot is what they're doing, right? So if they're all frozen in time, stand still, you have the background, you have the characters, but you have no plot, nothing's moving. Then you hit the play button kind of when the theater starts. And now they're doing something. So all the action, all the dialogues and talking. That's something if stories are hard for you to grasp, just start to pay attention to that, what's happening. Now, for those of you who know a little bit of Greek and Hebrew, here are some interesting facts for you that you maybe didn't learn in basic Hebrew or basic Greek. Here is just a little paragraph from Basics of Biblical Hebrew Grammar. This is one of the most well-known and used college textbooks on Hebrew by Gary Pratico and Van Pelt. And they're talking about in Hebrew you have two tenses called perfect and imperfect. And as they say here, usually the perfect conjugation is used to express a completed action and is usually translated by the English past tense. So I went, I talked, and so on. And then the imperfect conjugation is used to express incomplete action, usually translated by the English future or present tense. So I am walking, or I will walk. But there is something strange going on. Sometimes in narratives, they add the vow, which is just a conjunction. It means and, or but, or just beginning a new sentence. And sometimes, after that vow, just one letter, then sometimes the tense changes. That's the way this is taught to students. And just listen to this. Sounds pretty confusing, doesn't it? It says, when this vow comes in front of it, when used in the context of biblical narrative, sometimes in poetry, the imperfect verb, which is basic meaning is future or present tense, may be prefixed with a distinctive form of the conjunction vow and translated with the values of the perfect. So students are basically learning, and that's what I learned, and what you learned if you've done Hebrew. If you have an imperfect verb, but it begins with a vow, you translate it as in the past tense instead of future present. That's just bad advice, honestly. But that's kind of the tradition. That's how a lot of Bible translations do it. Most Bible translations do it. But this is very unfortunate, because there is a reason why it's in the imperfect and not in the perfect. That is, it is supposed to have the meaning of present. It's not supposed to be, it is not in the perfect tense, because it doesn't portray this as past. It portrays it as present. And the same thing in the Greek. Here is just kind of a general, quite popular Greek grammar by Daniel Wallace. And he says about the present tense, just like the Hebrew imperfect, the Greek has what's called a present. And sometimes we translate it in the past tense, just like people do with the Hebrew. He says, the historical present is used fairly frequently in narrative literature to describe a past event. Yeah, of course, everything happens in the Bible, so it's past. But that doesn't mean we should translate it as a past, because it's written in the form of a present. He is going. It doesn't say he went, it says he is going. Why does it say he is going? Why is it present tense in the Greek? The reason for the use of the historical present is normally to portray an event vividly, as though the reader were in the midst of the scene as it unfolds. So, the writer, New Testament writer, puts it in the Greek present tense because he wants you to feel like you are there. Now this is happening. Now this is happening. But most Bible translations in English put it into the past tense. Here is an example from Matthew 26. The ESV says, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter. So, he came and found and said. But actually in the Greek it says archetai, he's coming to the disciples, kai horiske, and he finds them sleeping. And lege, he says to them. So in the Greek this is all present tense. Why do we translate it in the past? I don't know, somebody gave translators a bad idea. Well, we say to each other, well, it's because it happened a while ago. So, he came to the disciples, found them sleeping, and he said. But that's a very inaccurate translation. Because in the Greek, it's present tense. He's coming to the disciples. And he finds them sleeping, and he says to them. The reason why, in this case, Matthew puts it in the present tense is because, as the grammars point out, they want us to feel the event happening right now in the present tense. This is all lost for people who don't know any Greek, right? They just have English translations, it's all in the past, and you lose the vividness because of the choice of most translators to translate these presents as past. And I don't like that. That's bad translation. And you kind of lose some of the drama when you read it in English translation. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out to you is that if you know Hebrew and you read the Hebrew narratives in the Old Testament, usually, it's not a complete absolute rule, but it happens quite a lot, that when the narrator or the author is describing the background, the location, the scene, it's in the perfect tense. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining. The house was white. Cows walked by. Past tense when it's describing the location, the background. But then when the action happens, it switches to imperfect tense, which is still translated in past tense in English, as we looked at. But now the action should instead be put into present, because now the narrator is telling you what's happening. He's doing this, and then he's doing this, and then he's doing this. So notice that if you happen to be blessed by some Hebrew knowledge, and when you read narratives, notice when it's perfect tense, proper, actual perfect tense, is usually describing the background, the location, and the scene. When it's the vowel consecutive, it's the imperfect with the vowel in front of it. Don't translate it in past tense. It's actually meant to be felt in the imperfect, in the present tense it is. Now this is happening and this is happening. Alright, so these are the three main elements of all storytelling, and if you should at any point read some books on how to be a good novel writer, these are the stuff you will learn. This is Storytelling 101. Background, location, scene. Number 2, characters. And number 3, the plot, the action, the dialogues. And if you have a hard time grasping stories, try to analyze this. Maybe buy 3 different highlighter pens and highlight the different elements of a story with 3 different colors so you can notice it. Yeah. Practical moral lessons. So, having analyzed the story into these 3 parts, so now you get the story better. You are now wondering, what should I say is a lesson out of this story? Sometimes that is harder than other times. The easiest is if there is a statement from God or Jesus or a prophet or the narrator of the book. If God comes on the scene and says something, if Jesus says something in the Gospels, or if Jesus is doing something, right, it must be right. Sometimes you wonder when God's people are doing something, is this supposed to be a good or a bad example for us? Hard to tell. If Jesus does something, we can assume it's good, right? We are meant to do that. Sometimes it's a prophet, sometimes it's the narrator. About the narrator, let me just switch back to the Bible here. Let's go to the book of Judges. I just typed in Ruth because it's easier to get to the end of Judges. Right, the book of Judges ends with this sentence. And, last time you read Judges, you probably felt there was a lot of blood and violence in that book, right? Why did God put the book of Judges in our Bible? Are we supposed to enjoy violence and bloodshed? No, we're not. But what's the lesson then of this book? Well, the narrator gives his moral opinion, his moral lesson from this entire book at the end of it. Whoever wrote Judges says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So we get one moral lesson out of Judges right here. That when there is a lack of good spiritual leadership, the fate of the nation goes down. Problems arise. Right? When there's a lack of good spiritual leadership with integrity, it goes bad. When there is good leadership, it goes better. But at this time, there was no king, there was no leader. So then everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You get kind of moral laxness and anarchy. All right, so that's a narrator, right? This is not one of the characters speaking. This is the narrator in the story speaking. Gives us kind of a moral viewpoint of that story. So look for that. Sometimes, or most of the times, there is no statement from God saying this was right or wrong, or Jesus or a prophet or a narrator. Then how do you get a lesson out of it? Well, you can compare it with easy texts in the Bible, like the Ten Commandments, right? So you take values you have elsewhere in the Bible, which are easy, right? You shall not steal, you shouldn't lie. And then when you see a character lying, you have a moral judgment on that part of the story because other parts of the Bible says that's bad. All right, so you compare it with the Ten Commandments or other easier, explicit passages in the Bible where you have moral values from. Then you take those moral values and you read the story in the light of biblical values. What you can also do is look at consequences of the actions within the narrative. Sometimes stories are short. You don't get to really see much of a consequence. You don't get enough to, understand if this was good or bad. Maybe there is no God or prophet. So then you just have to compare it with easier parts of the Bible, like the Ten Commandments. But sometimes you do get consequences within the story. Just to illustrate these three ways of getting to a practical lesson, let's take the well-known story of David and Bathsheba, right? I'm sure you remember the story. David was king in Israel. The king's palace was on top of Jerusalem, and then the rest of the town was kind of down the hill in the valley, and then up from the palace he could see down into a house further below, and he saw a beautiful woman inside a window taking a bath, and he abuses his power as king by summoning her to the palace, and he sleeps with her. is what we call a power rape. In today's social media times we live in, it's become a lot more awareness around particularly males abusing their power or authority to get women to do things for their own selfish pleasure, which they wouldn't have done if they had been allowed to actually choose without any bad consequence. So it was a power rape. Whether or not she really wanted to, it was bad of David to do it. But let's just pretend we don't know whether David sleeping with Bathsheba was a good or bad thing. Let's just pretend, right? How can we find out? Well, the first one, is there a statement from God, Jesus, prophet, or narrator in that story of David and Bathsheba? Yes, there is do you remember? There is a prophet, right, Nathan, who calls out David on this and tells a little parable, and David gets the point. Yeah, that's right. It was wrong of me to take Uriah's wife and sleep with her and then kill Uriah. So the prophet tells him it was bad. But let's assume we didn't have Nathan. Compared with the Ten Commandments, is there something in the Ten Commandments that says that adultery is wrong? Or that says that murder is wrong? Yep, we have it there. What about consequences within the story? Do we have that? Is adultery good or bad? Any consequences? Yes, the child conceived in that intercourse dies. And when we read the entire story of David and all his sexual infidelity and lack of monogamy leads to a lot of family problems, right? A lot of family trouble. There is no peace in that family. So we can see the consequences within that story as well. All right, so that's how we get to moral lessons from a story. Easier said than done. Easy to say this on a PowerPoint. Sometimes hard when it comes to specific stories. Now, let's go back to this element of, we talked about here, background, location, scene, number 2, characters, number 3, plot. If it helps you, then watch where the camera is. Unlike readers of the Bible throughout history, today we are quite used to movies, right? Moving pictures. So we are used to seeing stories visually with our eyes in the form of films and movies and TV. So this is maybe a format that is easier for you. Where is the camera? So when you look at a narrative in the Bible, just try to notice, where is the camera pointing? What is it pointing at? And we're going to look at that now in a couple of stories from Mark's Gospel. But if you want to pursue this further, a friend of mine, Grenville Kent, Australian, he did this doctoral dissertation on the story in 1 Samuel 28. And he has written his dissertation as a literary and filmic study of a narrative repetition in 1 Samuel 28. He's basically analyzed that story as if it was a movie and what's the film techniques used. A pretty cool book. Tom Shepard, a New Testament professor, also a friend of mine, he did kind of a cinema analysis of the Gospel of Mark, except he didn't call it filmic or cinematic. He used another term which is more common in biblical studies on Mark. They sometimes called it sandwich stories. Like a sandwich is made out of bread, something in the middle, some meat or cheese, and then another slice of bread. Bread, stuffing, bread, or ABA structure. That sandwich or ABA structure is quite common in the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to look at some of them now. If you want to compare it to movie making, this is what's called cross-cutting, where the camera is on one, looking at one thing, while at the same time something else is happening, and then after a while the camera switches to the other thing, and then maybe back again. So several things happening at the same time, but the camera is going back and forth. It's called cross-cutting. Just as an example, maybe the movie shows a man in the dark outside a house sneaking around the house corner with some scary music in the background. And then the camera switches to inside the house. We see a woman doing dishes in the kitchen, happy, unaware of what's happening outside. She is in her own world. Na 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 na. I'm doing dishes. Then the camera goes back outside again to the man who is now opening a window and going inside. Now, in our minds, we are now connecting these two camera positions, right? We are connecting the scary man outside with a happy, unaware woman inside, and we know what's going to happen, right? He's probably going to go to her and do something bad. We put them together in our minds because we're used to that. Well, Mark does that a lot, this back and forth, A, B, A. But unfortunately, we don't always notice it because we don't read the stories in the Bible like we are watching movies. We kind of put our brain aside and we don't get it. Well, some do. Tom Shepard did. So some people get it when they read the stories. But in case this has slipped by you when you read these stories in Mark, let's take a look at some of his cross-cutting or ABA stories. So let's begin with where the camera is, and then look at what's happening with the plot. The first story is in Mark chapter 3. Let me just go out of this. Well, maybe before we look at Mark 5, maybe we should go to Revelation 5, just to give a little warm-up exercise to noticing where the camera is pointing. This isn't, good question. Is this a narrative? Is it apocalyptic vision, or is it both? I think Revelation 4, and especially 5, definitely 5, is talking about what happened in heaven when Jesus came back to heaven from earth with mission accomplished on earth. He goes back to heaven and sits down at God the Father's right hand and starts ruling in heaven from the throne room in heaven. So it's kind of Jesus' inauguration as president, his inauguration as high priest in heaven. He begins his work, his ministry, his ruling from heaven. I think that's what's happening in Revelation 5. But let's just read it as a story, right? And noticing where the camera is pointing. Then I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne a scroll. Where's the camera now? It's zooming in on the scroll, right? Maybe we see God the Father on the throne and he's zooming in on his right hand on the scroll. And then suddenly there is a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll?" Now the camera turns to the angel. Verse 3, now the camera is zooming out, at everybody in attendance there. No one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or look into it. Right? Camera is zooming out at everybody, and nope, nobody's worthy. Now the camera is zooming into John. I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or look at it. And then it switches a little bit sideways to one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered." All right, so, and then we see Jesus as a lion, but then also he looks like a lamb. So it's metamorphing into another animal. It's a pretty cool vision. Anyway, after he is seated he takes the scroll and he's seated. Then the camera zooms out from Jesus and looks at the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders. and their harps and the bowl of incense, and then their song. And now we get to see and hear the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders sing and praise King Jesus. And now look at what the camera is doing. It's zooming out to everyone else who is in attendance in heaven here, to them. Myriads and myriads. It's literally tens of thousands times tens of thousands and thousands times thousands. Is this just, a metaphor for a lot of angels, or is this meant to be in a literal tens of thousands times tens of thousands, that, hundreds of million? Whatever the amount is meant to be, it's a lot of angels around the throne who is now singing, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain." Right? So look at the camera. The camera is zooming out, and now you see thousands, maybe millions of angels praising God. And now it's zooming out even further. Now we get to see everywhere in heaven and on earth and under the earth, in the sea. Everyone says, "To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever." Now it's zooming out. You see everyone in the universe praising President Jesus on the throne. And then it goes back to the 4 living creatures, said amen, and the elders fell down and worshipped. So notice where the camera is, if that helps you. All right. Now let's go to the cross-cutting techniques of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. And we're going to see how it switches, between A and B and A. Maybe we should do them a little bit in sequence. I have them in front of me here on the paper. Mark 3. Let's do that one first. Let's end with the Mark 5 one. Let me see. Yeah, it was Mark 3 I had first on the PowerPoint here. So first we're going to see Jesus' family. Then the camera is changing over to some of the leadership in Israel, some of the Pharisees and scribes who are accusing Jesus of working with the devil. And then it comes back to the topic of Jesus' family. So it's A, B, and A. It's a sandwich, right? Bread, cheese, bread. If you want A, B, A. So let's take a look. So from verse 30, it starts with Jesus' family. Then Jesus went home, and the crowd gathered again, so they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, when his own heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, "Es loco, he's out of his mind, he's crazy." Right, so what do we learn about Jesus' relationship to his own family? Are they believers in him? Do they support him? Nope. They think he's a bit crazy, right? Goes around, says crazy stuff. They are embarrassed by him. Now, it's over to the B. The camera is switching now to the scribes of Israel. And what do they say? They say, "He's possessed by Beelzebul. By the prince of demons, he cast out demons." And now we get a little bit of a dialogue between the characters, between the scribes, who are not named, and Jesus. He calls them to him and said to them in parables, "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand." So basically, Jesus says, it makes no sense that I'm working together with Satan because I'm throwing out demons. Satan wouldn't do that. Why would Satan throw out his own demons? If Satan's house is divided, he can't stand. Satan wouldn't do that. Of course I'm not working with Satan. That's basically the message. But notice this use of the word house. If a house is divided against itself. What did we learn about here in the beginning of the story, in the A section? Jesus' own house is divided against him. Then how can Jesus say, house cannot be divided. Then it won't stand. All right, well, let's go back to verse 31 to 35. This is back to the A section again, back to the family. His mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Hey, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." He answered them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" He says, "Here are my mothers and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." Is Jesus' house divided? No, because Jesus' real family are those who are doing the will of God, right, and are following Jesus. So Jesus is redefining house, redefining family. Jesus' true family are not necessarily blood related. It's those who are brothers and sisters in God. All right. Now, do you see how more interesting this story gets when you see the cross-cutting here? The A and B, and then back to A again? Did you notice that when you were reading it? Yeah, maybe not. Try to notice how narratives are structured in the Bible. Okay, let's take another example. Mark chapter 6. In the A section, Jesus sends out the 12 disciples 2 and 2, tell them to expect resistance and rejection. Then after that, verses 14 to 29, the camera switches completely elsewhere to John the Baptist, who is executed for faithfully preaching God's values to Herod Antipas. You remember John had said to King Herod, "You're not supposed to take your brother's wife. That's immoral. God doesn't want it." And in the end, he was executed. But then it goes back again. The next thing that's happening is we see the 12 return to Jesus for a debrief. And what is it Jesus tells them there? It's again about, being willing to suffer resistance and rejection. And why is it important, or what's the value of seeing this ABA structure? Well, now we get the lesson that we definitely should expect tough times as a disciple of Jesus. Maybe even, look at what happened to John the Baptist, maybe even resulting in death. So Mark has put the story of John the Baptist being faithful and ending up giving his life for God's kingdom in the middle of the story of the 12 meeting resistance, in order to really drive home the lesson here. It's tough to be a disciple. It might cost you everything, maybe even your life. Look at John the Baptist. All right, so now the final example from the Gospel of Mark is Mark chapter 5. So the A section, verses 21 to 24, is about Jairus, the synagogue leader. Then, verses 25 to 34, we get an interlude, we get another scene. The camera is going somewhere else. Now we see Jesus healing a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years by the woman coming up behind Jesus and touching him. And then Jesus eventually comes to the home of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and he heals, or actually resurrects his daughter from the dead. So that's a pretty clear ABA structure in that story. Let's head over to the Bible and take a look. So Mark 5. What verse was that? 21. All right. Again, remember to look at the camera. Where's the camera pointing? Is it pointing at the background, the location, the scenery? Is it looking at a character? And are there some action going on, some dialogue, some kind of plot? Right, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. All right, if we were going to show this story in a short film, where would the camera be right here? Well, maybe it would start out with, a drone filmage, up above the Lake of Galilee, and then it's kind of zooming in on Jesus down on the beach, crossing to the other side, right? And there's a great crowd there. But the camera is pretty, pretty zoomed out. It's pretty wide angle. You see a lot of people. But now it focuses on one character, one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him fell at his feet. So here comes a character falling down in front of Jesus at his feet, and implored him earnestly, saying, little dialogue, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be well and live." And Jesus went with him. That was the A section, right? Jesus and Jairus. And the great crowd followed him and thronged about him. Yeah. This could kind of be a transition, kind of between the A and the B. It kind of belongs to both. Transition. And then as he goes along towards the house of Jairus, we need another character in the story. There was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And those who read the Gospel of Mark in the early days, they immediately understood what this entailed, right? A woman bleeding for 12 years. I don't know personally what it's like to bleed. I can imagine bleeding every month. I can imagine that's pretty painful, right? That's what my wife and other friends are telling. It's painful with a monthly menstruation. And, it's a combination of physical pain and emotional pain. And in the time of Jesus, it was a third thing. It was even social pain. When you were bleeding, you were considered impure. So if you were married, your husband wouldn't sleep in your bed. He shouldn't even sit in a seat that the woman had been sitting in when menstruating. There's a rule about that in the Mishnah. You really shouldn't touch anything a menstruating woman was touching. Now, if you've been constantly bleeding for 12 years, socially, you've been an outcast now for 12 years. You've been impure. People were not supposed to socially interact with you. So, this is just a woman who has a terrible, terrible life, right? For 12 years. That's a pretty long time. Verse 26, she has suffered much, and many physicians had spent all that she had. The Americans among you who are listening to this can more readily understand this than maybe us Europeans who have good public health care we're taken care of. We don't go broke with health problems. But you Americans will understand this. You're out of money. You are financially bankrupt because of medical bills. She had used all she had, and it didn't even help. She was no better, but rather grew worse. Physically, emotionally, socially, this is as bad as it gets. Really a horrific life. She really deserves some love and healing, right? Verse 27, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So, we can't really understand what that's like. 12 years of blood running. But we can understand enough that this must be a wonderful feeling, right? She sensed it. She's healed. It's gone. So, wonderful moment. But then Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Camera now goes to the disciples, who said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" Maybe the camera would zoom out to see the big crowd again. He looked around to see who had done it. And now camera goes to the woman. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. She's just been so happy. Now Jesus is pointing out what has happened, and now she's afraid. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "I've been bleeding for 12 years. I wanted to touch you to be healed." He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Here is a little dilemma for Bible translators. The Greek word sozo can mean to heal, or it can mean to save. So how do you translate it? Your faith has saved you, or your faith has healed you? Well, the ESV goes with neither. It chickens out and says, "made you well." Maybe that's a good compromise, right? It can be either. But of course, in biblical theology, with a holistic view of mankind, the spiritual and the physical go hand in hand. God really wants to heal both, right? He wants us to be as healed as we can bodily. And if it doesn't happen in this world, it will definitely happen in the next. And he also wants us spiritually, to be saved for eternity. We don't always get all of it now, but God wants us eventually to have it all. Physical, spiritual, eternal life, it all hangs together. Your faith has healed you and saved you. Go in peace. Shalom is probably what Jesus said in Hebrew. And be healed of your disease. All right, so after that, it's back to the A story. It's back to Jairus. But even before we go there, just compare these two stories, the A and B. Look at the contrast here. Socially, the ruler of the synagogue, where was he on the hierarchy of society? He was pretty high up, right? He was a leader of the synagogue. He has a lot of social standing, status in that town. And how does he approach Jesus? Fell at his feet. So publicly, in front of Jesus, he falls down in front of Jesus. Why publicly? Well, he's used to public recognition, right? He's a man of the public. He doesn't hide things because he's well established. And in the contrast is a woman, not a man, but the second one is a woman, who is socially ostracized because of her bleeding, and she is not well established in society. Socially, she's the opposite, and she's suffering emotionally, physically, financially. She's at the bottom of society at the day, right? And how does she approach Jesus? Privately, kind of secretly, is coming to Jesus from behind. Now, what does Jesus do? That's an interesting thing. When a person with low or non-social recognition comes and needs healing, Jesus heals the person, but in addition, Jesus makes a big public spectacle out of it. Jesus makes it into a public event. He gets everyone's attention and says, "Who did this?" And the woman comes forward, and then he says publicly, he commends her publicly, saying, "Go in shalom, you've been healed, you've had a great faith. Good for you, You are healed." So he restores her publicly. If she had gone home, she would have been, healed physically, but she needs also to be restored socially, right? Jesus sees that, and so he does it. Now, you can probably try to guess, if you are good at, thinking ahead. Here is a public figure, Jairus, approaches Jesus publicly. How do you think Jesus is going to respond? Well, there was a woman with no status who came privately, and Jesus made it into public because she needed more public recognition. What does Jesus do with a man who has plenty of public recognition? Let's take a look. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But then Jesus went there anyway, came to the house. By the way, now he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. So Jesus is now limiting the crowd. He's making it more private. Just Peter, James, and John. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So it's a big public event, but what does Jesus do? He says, "Why are you weeping? The child is not dead but sleeping." They laughed at him because, in biblical theology, being death is like a sleep, right? It's waiting for the next phase of the resurrection. But they didn't understand that. They laughed at him, thought Jesus hadn't understood that she was dead. So he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. All right, so what is Jesus doing here? He has a crowd with him at the beginning of this second A section. But then he dismisses everyone except Peter, James, and John. They come to the house. He goes into the house, and then he goes into the room where the child was, taking only the father and mother and those who were with him, probably Peter, James, and John. So he goes to a smaller and smaller audience that's with him, right? Fewer and fewer people. He's making this more and more private. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, and we get this in the original Aramaic, Talitha Kumi. Kumi means get up, Talitha means little girl, but Mark, who's writing, as we know, to a Roman audience who are not Jews, they don't understand Aramaic, so Mark translated little girl. It means, he translates Aramaic Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. All right. She was 12 years of age. This is a narrator's comment. This is Mark stating this. It's not something Jesus is saying. It's Mark telling us as readers. What happened 12 years ago? Two things happened 12 years ago, right? This girl was born, and the woman started bleeding. Right? Mark is saying, in case you haven't combined the two stories yet, I'm making it explicit for you here. These two stories go together. So you just can't miss it with that comment. 12 years. That connects both stories. The girl was born 12 years ago. Same time the woman started bleeding. And now they're both healed, saved, resurrected on the same day, 12 years later. All right, so what do we get out of reading these stories kind of together, the A and the B together? Well, I think, we talked about the characters. There's a contrast between socially important synagogue leader who falls down in front of Jesus publicly, and then a sick, lonely, socially ostracized woman who fearfully touches Jesus privately, secretly. But then Jesus does the opposite, and the woman who has no social standing, Jesus elevates her publicly. And Jairus, the synagogue leader who has plenty of social recognition, Jesus does this miracle privately. If you've got a lot of public attention, you don't need any more. But those who don't have it, they need the social recognition. All right. That's a lesson you don't get if you don't read these two together. Right? You can only get that lesson by seeing the contrast between the two characters and the contrast in Jesus' actions towards these two, that they are the opposite actions. All right, so it's, please read Gospel of Mark especially carefully, but all storytelling in the Bible are very carefully, deliberately done. All the details are there for a purpose, to tell a story well so we understand it. But we often don't pay attention as we should. All right, that's the lessons I just talked about. So that's a little bit of introduction to stories in the Bible. The Bible is full of narratives. If it's been a while since you were preaching on narratives last, then please go ahead and do it from the Gospels, by all means, and from other narratives throughout the Bible.